This is Political and Economic Change in Iran, Objective 2, about the modern empirical period of Iran. In Objective 1, we took a look at a couple of the ancient empires and moved into the Safavids, which gets us more toward the modern day. Well, we're going to continue that in Objective 2 with two major dynasties that take place, the Qajar dynasty and the Pahlavi dynasty, with some revolution for constitutional ideals mixed into the whole discussion here. Now, I am going to mispronounce a number of things, I believe. I don't speak Arabic, so you just have to bear with me. I may not necessarily get it all right, but we'll do the best we can, so stick with me. We're going to start with letter A on Objective 2 about the Qajar dynasty, which rules Iran from 1794 to 1925. Now, they conquer Persia 72 years after the Safavids fall. So the Safavids were not conquered by them. They were already out of power for a while, and there was this period of chaos. But the Qajars take that over, and they move the capital from Isfahan, which is right here, up to Tehran. Now that's still the capital today, so that's a legacy that they have. Now, what's interesting about them is that even though they're from a foreign land, they keep Shiism as the official state religion, as a nod to the people of that region, I guess you would say. But the one thing they did do that the Iranians didn't really care for is that they created a separation between church and government. Now, previous empires had always connected those two things together, and the Qajars, when they create that separation, it doesn't go real well, but they really don't necessarily have a choice. See, the Safavids before them could claim to be descendants of the 12 Imams, which is something that was covered in Lesson 1. They all believe the Imams are direct descendants of Muhammad, as it was believed. So the Safavids could claim that they were descendants of Muhammad and these 12 Imams. The Qajars, on the other hand, were foreigners who conquered Iran. So they couldn't claim that they were descendants of the 12 Imams in order to bring their government legitimacy. In order to be legitimate, they were going to have to do something different. Otherwise, people wouldn't be willing to follow them. So they took the religious aspect, the Muhammad aspect, right out of things and said, we don't have to be descendants of Muhammad to rule. And frankly, that rubs some people the wrong way. What also doesn't help the Qajars is that eventually they're going to lose land to the Russians and to the British in terms of oil drilling rights, and they're going to borrow from other nations. You can see on the map right here all the territories that were lost or exchanged or whatever the case may be. But the bottom line is that the Qajars put Iran deeply in debt, despite the fact that the Shah is living a pretty good lifestyle. He's doing well. The people are not, and they're essentially giving away all their wealth. Okay, take a look at letter B here, because we're going to get into the period from 1905 to 1909 when the people of Iran basically say they've had enough. And that is with the Constitutional Revolution. Now, it begins with business owners protesting what the Qajars are doing. The Qajars are collecting tariffs from other nations when they try to sell goods in Iran, but they're giving those collections to the Europeans rather than paying off any debts with them. Also, the Shah kind of creates his own problem because he provides for a constitution. Now, this is because the British had a history of more democratic ideas and convinced the Shah to do that. Well, the result was more direct elections, more separation of powers, an actual elected legislature, popular sovereignty, the idea that people can decide for themselves, and a Bill of Rights. The British might have thought that was great. The Shah didn't necessarily, even though they kept the monarchy. The problem was the monarchy was regulated by a strong legislature. The Malays is what I'm going to call them, in order to balance things out. They didn't want the Shah to be as powerful as he was. Now, this is the Malays today, and basically to give them power, cabinet members of this new constitution reported to the Malays, not the Shah. They did reserve seats in the legislature guaranteed to the people of the book, if you remember, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and of course Muslims. But the cabinet members are not directly responsible to the Shah, so his power has been diminished a little bit. Now, this is going to spark, if you take a look at B3, this is going to start a pretty big debate about the separation of church and state and whether or not it should happen. But Shiism does remain the official state religion during this time and was still a large part of the government, as Shiites were the only ones who could be on the cabinet to begin with, regardless of whether they reported to the Shah or not. Cabinet members were going to be Shiite, and a guardian council of Shiites was put in place that could veto bills coming out of the legislature. So the bottom line is, no matter how much they tried to separate church and state, it was still a very big part of the new government. So that seems to be working okay, but then they're working out the bugs, they're trying to figure it out, and then World War I screws up everything. After World War I is over, and so many other nations had tried to have influence in the region, the Russians and the British control some of the oil-producing regions of Iran, like we had said before. And also some divisions within the legislature basically make the Malays completely ineffective. They really can't do much at that point. Well, it's shortly after World War I that a new dynasty is going to take over to try to fix the mess, if you will. Now, if you take a look at letter C here, that new dynasty is the Pahlavi dynasty, which is going to rule Iran from 1925 to 1979, most of the 20th century. And it's created by this guy, a guy named Colonel Reza Shah of the Cossack Brigade, which was the most dominant part of the Iranian military at that time. He essentially overthrows the Qajars and gives himself the title of Shah, which is the first time anybody had done that since the ancient Persian days of Cyrus and Darius. Now, Reza is going to rule as Shah for 16 years before he turns the mantle over to his son, Muhammad Reza, in 1941, right as World War II is actually picking up steam. Now, the new Shah is immediately challenged as working class people want some say in government, want some services for themselves, and so the Tudeh party, which is communist, starts giving him some issues. But the bigger issue was the National Front. Now, if you take a look at C3b, the National Front is led by a guy named Muhammad Mossadegh, and Mossadegh was a representative of the middle class, very nationalistic, very proud of being Iranian. And as a result of Mossadegh's rising influence, the Shah is basically forced to flee the country, and he heads for the United States. And this is where some of the problems that the Middle Easterners have with the United States begin kicking in. The main reason is that the people wanted Mossadegh, but because of oil interests in the region, this is Harry Truman here in the picture with the Shah, put the Shah back into power in 1952 in order to maintain those oil interests so we can have a friend in the region and keep getting oil from them. Well, that leads to a pretty big problem and a bad view of the United States by the Iranian people, who begin to see the Shah as a puppet of the U.S. government. And you can kind of see why. Here's the Shah with John F. Kennedy, President Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, and President Richard Nixon. So you get to the point where people start seeing the Shah more as a puppet of the United States than a leader of them, and they start losing respect for him pretty quickly. It's also during this time, if you take a look at letter C5, flipping the page here, that Iran becomes a rentier state. And this is something you're going to want to know for AP tests as far as a definition of what this means. Basically, it means that the oil industry in particular is supported by the government while the government receives rent from other countries. So Iran is exporting its oil and leasing its oil fields to foreign nations, which is something that's still continuing today. And by 1970, the yield is so high that they didn't even have to tax their people anymore. Most expenses were paid through oil income. That's a great thing, but the downside of that is that Iran becomes a one-product economy, oil being the one product, and a lot of times the upper class was really benefiting, the poor class was really suffering, so a lot of the money was going toward the government, and the middle class really is falling out of existence. Basically, if you look at number 6 now, what Reza and his father had done, what Muhammad and his father Reza had done, was to build a highly centralized authoritarian state. They had control of the banks, the media, and the most important thing, the Iranian oil company. They also built up the armed forces into the fifth largest in the world by 1979, most likely due to Reza's time that he spent in the Cossack Brigade. But if you look at them today, they're still a fairly big military that is honored and considered glorious in the eyes of the Iranian people, although I kind of think they could use some bigger submarines. Now, other things that are making the people a little suspicious of Reza has to do with just his general attitudes. It seems like the quote-unquote puppet of the United States and leasing oil interests to other countries, they feel like he's starting to be westernized and a little bit less like a Middle Easterner. A case in point, he switches the local government to give bureaucracy more control, something that really hadn't been seen a whole lot. And the court system becomes very non-religious. It didn't have a lot of the Muslim religious law aspects to it. It was a European-style judicial system. This is the courts, their version of the Supreme Court in Tehran. But what may have been the worst in the eyes of the Iranian people was the White Revolution, which was meant to counter the influence of the Tudeh party or the communist or red influences. Red is often, in history you'll hear people referring to communism as the Red Menace or something like that. So he called this the White Revolution. And in this one, the government buys land and sells it to small farmers at affordable prices. That wasn't so bad. He extended voting rights to women, though, and restricted polygamy and allowed women to work outside the home, which may be fine by us over here in the West, but to Muslims in the Middle East, it wasn't so great. And they feel like he's trying to westernize too much. If you take a look at number 11, they also established the Pahlavi Foundation, which was a patronage system. And if you look at number 12, he creates the Resurgence Party, which makes his party, the Shah's party, the only party in Iran. He replaces the Islamic calendar. He is teaching a new version of Islam to the people, which they're suspicious of, and he gives himself some exalted titles like Guide to the New Great Civilization and Light of the Aryans. As you can imagine, this is setting up some potential problems, and we'll be covering that in the next objective about the Iranian Revolution against the Shah.